The envelope landed on the marble table like a verdict. Renata Caldwell Price stood at the edge of the dining room, one hand resting on the back of a chair, her chin lifted, the way it always was when she had already decided how something would end. She was wearing white. She had chosen that on purpose. "Sign it," she said. Marcus Price looked at the envelope. He didn't reach for it. He didn't flinch. He just sat there in the chair he had sat in every morning for 6 years, and he looked at the envelope the way a man looks at something that no longer has power over him. Then he smiled. Not a broken smile. Not a sad one. The kind of smile that knows something the other person in the room does not. "Before you celebrate," Marcus said quietly, "you might want to check who owns Caldwell Foods this morning." Renata laughed. The sound filled the room. Marcus didn't make a sound, and that was the moment Renata Caldwell Price realized she had made the worst mistake of her life. If you've ever watched someone underestimate the wrong person, stay with me. Because this story is about to show you exactly what patience looks like when it finally stands up. Drop a comment right now and tell me, where are you watching from and what time is it there? I read every single one. And if you are new here, hit that subscribe button and turn on your notifications because you do not want to miss what happens next. Atlanta never slept all the way. Even on a quiet Tuesday morning, the city hummed delivery trucks rolling down Peachtree Street. Before sunrise, the smell of coffee drifting out of corner shops. The distant sound of a train somewhere beneath the ground. Atlanta was a city that believed in itself. A city that rewarded the bold and quietly swallowed the ones who confused cruelty for strength. The Caldwell family had lived in Atlanta for 3 generations. They had built their name the slow, honorable way, Aldrich Caldwell Sr., starting with one small grocery store on the South Side stocking shelves himself, learning every customer's name, extending credit to families who needed it during hard months. By the time his son Aldrich Jr. took over, there were 11 stores. By the time Aldrich Jr. handed partial control to his daughter, Renata Caldwell, Foods was a regional chain worth $60 million with 42 locations across Georgia, Alabama, and Tennessee, employing 300 people who depended on those paychecks to keep their lives together. It was a legacy built on trust. Renata Caldwell Price had spent the last 3 years quietly preparing to sell it. Renata was 34 years old, and she was the kind of beautiful that made people forgive things they should not have forgiven. She walked into rooms like she had designed them. She wore her hair natural and pulled back at work, all business, and wore it loose on weekends like a different woman entirely. She had a laugh that sounded warm until you listened closely and realized it only ever appeared when something was going her way. At Caldwell Foods headquarters on the 14th floor of a glass building in Midtown, Renata's office faced east. She liked to watch the morning light come in and think about the future, her future. Not the company's, not her father's. Hers. She had a vision board on the wall behind her desk that her assistant assumed was about business goals. It was not. It had photos of a coastline in Portugal, a villa, a man who was not her husband. Marcus Price taught art at Westview High School, 12 miles from that glass building, in a classroom that smelled like paint and possibility. He was 37 years old, with quiet eyes and hands that were always slightly stained cadmium yellow on his left thumb most mornings, burnt sienna along his right wrist on Fridays when he let his advanced students work freely. He was not a loud man. He did not need to be. When Marcus walked into a room, people felt settled, like something steady had arrived. His students loved him in the way students love teachers who actually see them. There was a girl in his 3rd period class named Amara, 17 years old, sharp as a tack, wanted to study graphic design. Marcus had already written her a recommendation letter and made 3 phone calls to colleges on her behalf without telling anyone. That was the kind of man he was, the kind who did the work quietly and never asked for recognition. He drove a 7-year-old sedan. He packed his own lunch. He wore the same 3 sport coats in rotation. And 3 years ago, through a financial advisor and 4 carefully constructed shell entities, he had begun purchasing shares in Caldwell Foods under the name M. Sterling, patiently, methodically, one quiet transaction at a time. Nobody knew. Not even Renata. They had met at a gallery opening 5 years ago. That part was true. What was also true, though Marcus had only learned it later, was that Renata had not been there by accident. Her grandfather's will contained a clause that Aldrich Jr. had never mentioned to his daughter until her 32nd birthday. Full voting shares of Caldwell Foods would only transfer to Renata upon her marriage. If she remained unmarried past 35, control would pass to a board of trustees instead. Renata had done the math in under 60 seconds. She had spent 2 weeks identifying candidates. Marcus had made her list because he was educated, presentable, calm, and most importantly, in her estimation, unremarkable enough to manage. She had walked across that gallery floor and introduced herself with a smile that had taken her 20 minutes to practice in the mirror. Marcus had smiled back and offered her a glass of water because she looked like she hadn't had any all evening. He had been right. She had been charmed in spite of herself. She had told herself it didn't matter. They were married 11 months later in a ceremony that Atlanta society attended and admired. Aldrich walked his daughter down the aisle with tears in his eyes. Cecilia, Renata's mother, wore a hat that cost more than Marcus's monthly salary and spent the reception referring to her new son-in-law as the school teacher, never by his name. Marcus had heard every word. He had smiled anyway, shaken hands, thanked people for coming, and driven home that night in his 7-year-old sedan alone with a thought he did not yet know what to do with. Miss Opal Hensley had worked at Caldwell Foods for 30 years before retiring. She was 67 with silver locks and reading glasses she wore on a beaded chain around her neck. She had known Aldrich Sr. She had watched the company grow from the inside out. She still came by the headquarters once a month because she had what the family's original attorney had called board observation rights, a small clause in an old agreement that nobody had bothered to remove when she retired because nobody had thought it mattered. It mattered. On a Friday afternoon, 6 months before Renata slid those divorce papers across the marble table, Miss Opal drove 12 miles to Westview High School with a container of homemade red beans and rice and a manila envelope she had been sitting on for 3 weeks. She found Marcus in his classroom after the last bell-cleaning brushes at the sink. "Baby," she said, setting the food on his desk, "I need you to eat something first, because what I'm about to show you is going to change things." Marcus dried his hands on a paint rag. He looked at her carefully. "Miss Opal." His voice was steady. "How bad is it?" She placed the envelope on the desk between them. "Bad enough that I drove across town on a Friday." Marcus sat down. He opened the envelope. He pulled out the first page and read it slowly, then the second. His jaw tightened on the third page almost imperceptibly, the only outward sign of what was happening inside his chest. He read the first page, then the second. By the third, he understood exactly what his wife had been planning and how long she had been planning it. The document in Marcus's hands was 41 pages long. Miss Opal had printed every page herself at the library 3 blocks from her house, paying for the copies out of her own pocket, because she did not want any record on the Caldwell Foods network. She had highlighted the critical sections in yellow. She had written small notes in the margins in her careful schoolteacher handwriting dates, names, amounts. Marcus read for 22 minutes without saying a word. Miss Opal sat across from him and ate her red beans and rice and did not rush him. When he finally set the papers down, the classroom was completely quiet, except for the sound of the heating unit in the corner and a janitor's cart rolling slowly down the hallway outside. "She's selling it," Marcus said. "She's selling it," Miss Opal confirmed. "And my father-in-law doesn't know. Aldrich thinks she's been in talks with a regional expansion partner. She showed him a presentation in February. Very professional, very clean." Miss Opal tapped the envelope. What she showed him and what's actually in those term sheets are two entirely different documents. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. His hands were flat on the desk. Still. The way a man's hands go still when he is working very hard not to show what he is feeling. "The employees," he said. 90 days after closing," Miss Opal said softly. "All 300. Gone." Something moved across Marcus's face. It was not anger exactly. It was something older and quieter than anger. It was the expression of a man who had already suspected the world could be this careless with people, and was still somehow sorrowful to be proven right. He nodded once. Then he picked up his phone and made a call. But to understand why Marcus Price made that call and what it cost him to make it, you have to go back further. Back to before the envelope, before Miss Opal's visit, before the shares and the shell companies and the name M. Sterling. You have to go back to a Thursday afternoon 2 years earlier when Marcus arrived at his art studio and found the lock changed. He had rented the studio space for 4 years, a 700-square-foot room above a hardware store on the west side with good north-facing light and walls he had slowly covered with his own work. Paintings he had made over a decade. Large canvases, small studies, an entire series he had spent 14 months completing about his grandmother's hands at different ages. That series was supposed to be the centerpiece of a show he had been planning for the spring. He stood outside the locked door for a long moment, his key in his hand. Then he called the landlord. The landlord, a man named Gerald Potts, answered on the third ring and sounded uncomfortable from the first word. "Marcus," Gerald said. "I was going to call you." "Gerald, my key doesn't work." A pause. "I know. I'm sorry about this. I really am. But I got a call last month. Look, I don't want any trouble, you understand." The caller said there had been some incidents, behavioral issues. Said it might create liability problems for the building. Marcus's hand tightened around the phone. "Who called you, Gerald?" Another pause. Longer this time. I'd rather not say. It was someone who said they knew you. Someone concerned." "Gerald." Marcus's voice stayed level. Absolutely level. "Everything I own is in that room. 2 years of work is in that room. I know, and I'm sorry. I really am. But I have other tenants to think about, and if there's any question of—" "There is no question," Marcus said quietly. "You know me. You have known me for 4 years." Silence on the line. I can give you until the end of the week to collect your things," Gerald said finally. "I'm real sorry, Marcus." Marcus hung up. He stood on the sidewalk outside the hardware store and looked up at the window of his studio, the window with the good north light, and he did not move for a very long time. His chest was tight. His eyes burned. He pressed his back against the brick wall of the building, and he breathed. In, out, slowly. The way you breathe when you are trying to hold something together that very much wants to fall apart. He thought about his grandmother's hands. 14 months of work. He thought about the spring show. He thought about the students he had told about it, Amara, who had been excited enough to tell her mother, who had already planned to come. He stood there for 1 full hour. Then he wiped his face with the back of his hand, straightened his jacket, and walked to his car. He had an afternoon class to teach. When Marcus walked into third period that day, Amara looked up from her sketchbook and immediately knew something was wrong. She had that gift, that particular sensitivity some young people carry before the world teaches them to stop paying attention. She waited until the other students were working. Then she walked up to his desk. "Mr. Price," she said quietly. "You okay?" Marcus looked at her. He considered lying. He had always been good at the calm face, the steady voice. "Not entirely," he said honestly. Amara nodded slowly like she appreciated the truth. "Somebody take something from you." He looked at her for a moment. This 17-year-old girl with paint on her sneakers and a future so bright it almost hurt to look at. "Sometimes people take things from you," Marcus said. "The only answer is to build something they can't take." Amara looked at him steadily. "Then I guess you better start building." She went back to her seat. Marcus sat with those words for the rest of the afternoon. He turned them over the way you turn a stone over in your hand, feeling the weight, the edges, the possibility. He already knew somewhere in the quiet part of himself who had made that call to Gerald Potts. He had no proof, but he knew. And he understood something else now, something he should have understood months earlier, on the night he drove home from that wedding reception in his 7-year-old sedan, listening to Cecilia's voice still echoing in his head. The schoolteacher. He was not going to fight. He was not going to confront. He was not going to beg. That night, Marcus made a phone call to a financial advisor named Sterling. What he set in motion would take 3 years. But Marcus Price was a patient man. The dinner had been Cecilia's idea. She called it a family gathering. 12 people around the long mahogany table in the Caldwell family home on Cascade Road, a house with 14 rooms, a circular driveway, and a portrait of Aldrich Sr. hanging in the foyer that watched everyone who came and went with the patient eyes of a man who had earned every inch of what he built. Renata had told Marcus about the dinner on a Wednesday 3 days before in the tone she used for calendar items she considered administrative. "Sunday, 6 o'clock. Don't wear the gray jacket." Marcus had worn the gray jacket. He sat at the far end of the table from Aldrich between 2 of Renata's cousins, who spoke to each other across him as though he were a floral arrangement. The food was excellent. Cecilia had hired a caterer, which she always did for family dinners, because she considered cooking beneath her station. The conversation moved the way it always moved in that house around business, around appearances, around carefully managed impressions of how well everyone was doing. Marcus ate quietly. He listened. He had learned over 6 years of these dinners that listening in the Caldwell family home was its own kind of education. It was Cecilia who struck first the way she always did, not with a shout, but with a smile. She was speaking to her sister Paulette about a charity luncheon when she turned as if remembering something small and looked down the table at Marcus. "Oh, Marcus," she said pleasantly. "I keep meaning to ask, are they still letting teachers do those little art shows? I saw something in the community newsletter. I wasn't sure if the school had the budget for that sort of thing anymore." The table didn't go fully quiet, just slightly quieter, the way a room adjusts when something with an edge has been placed on the table. Marcus looked at Cecilia. He picked up his water glass. He took a slow sip. "The program's doing well," he said. "Thank you for asking." Cecilia smiled wider. "Of course. It's just so important to have hobbies, especially when the work itself is well." She tilted her head. "You know." She turned back to Paulette without finishing the sentence. She didn't need to finish it. Everyone at the table had heard the missing words as clearly as if she'd spoken them aloud, especially when the work itself doesn't amount to much. Renata, sitting 3 seats away, laughed softly at something her cousin said. She did not look at Marcus. She did not say a word. 12 people heard it. Not one of them spoke up. Marcus set his fork down very gently. He finished his water. He folded his napkin beside his plate with the kind of deliberate care that is its own form of dignity. "Excuse me," he said quietly. He pushed back his chair, stood, and walked to the back porch. The night air was cool. 61 degrees Fahrenheit, the kind of Atlanta autumn evening that reminded you summer had finally given up. Marcus stood at the porch railing and looked out at the garden, immaculate, professionally maintained, every hedge trimmed to within an inch of its life. He heard the door open behind him. He expected Renata. He waited for her footsteps, for her voice, for some version of an explanation that would be almost an apology, but not quite. The footsteps were slower than Renata's. The door closed softly. "Baby," said Miss Opal. Marcus let out a long, slow breath. "She didn't even pause," he said. 12 people at that table. Not one of them said a word. Miss Opal came and stood beside him at the railing. She was quiet for a moment, looking out at the same immaculate garden. "Your grandmother used to say," Miss Opal began, "that the loudest thing in any room is what nobody says." Marcus nodded slowly. His jaw was tight. His hands gripped the railing, his knuckles pressed pale against the wood, and he stared at the garden the way a man stares at something. He is trying very hard not to let destroy him. "And I loved her," he said. The words came out low and bare. "I actually did, in the beginning. Whatever she felt about me, I was real." Miss Opal put her hand over his on the railing. She didn't say anything. Sometimes the most honest response to a truth like that is just to stay. They stood there together in the cool October air until the sounds of the dinner floated out through the glass doors. Laughter, the scrape of chairs, Cecilia's voice rising above the rest, the way it always did, and Marcus straightened up, squared his shoulders, breathed in. "I'm all right," he said. Miss Opal patted his hand once and went back inside. Marcus stayed another 3 minutes. Then he followed. The escalation, when it came, arrived not in dramatic gestures, but in the quiet, grinding way Renata did most things she did not want witnessed. 2 weeks after the Sunday dinner, Marcus's credit card was declined at the gas station 2 blocks from the school. He called the bank. The card had been reported as lost and canceled from their joint account, which Renata managed. He said nothing to her about it. He opened a new account the following day. A week after that, he came home to find their housekeeper, a woman named Bernice, who had worked for them for 4 years, packing a small box of her personal items in the kitchen. "Bernice," Marcus said carefully. "What's happening?" Bernice looked up. Her face was complicated, embarrassed and sorry at the same time. "Mrs. Price called me this morning," she said quietly. She said the position had been eliminated, that you had decided." Bernice stopped. She looked at him directly. "She said it was your decision, Mr. Price." Marcus was very still. "Bernice," he said, "let me make some calls. You will be paid for the full month." Bernice nodded. Her eyes were wet. "I know you didn't do this," she whispered. After she left, Marcus stood alone in the kitchen for a long time. The silence of the house pressed in around him, the big, expensive, hollow silence of a home that had never quite been a home. He did not react. He did not confront Renata that evening. He simply went to his desk, opened his laptop, and sent a carefully worded email to his financial advisor. What Renata didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that the man she was trying to erase had already rewritten the ending of her story. The office of Sterling Financial Consulting occupied the 3rd floor of a modest building on Cascade Avenue. No lobby fountain, no glass walls, no receptionist, who looked like she belonged in a magazine. Just a clean waiting room, good lighting, and a man named Everett Cole, who had spent 30 years helping people build wealth so quietly that nobody saw it coming until it was already done. Everett was 61 years old, broad-shouldered, and wore the same style of dark suit every day, the way some men wore a uniform. He had been Marcus's financial advisor for 3 years. He had never once asked Marcus why. He had simply looked at the numbers, nodded slowly, and said, "This is going to take patience." Marcus had said, "I have plenty of that." On the morning that Renata slid the divorce papers across the marble table, Marcus had already been sitting in Everett's office for 45 minutes. He sat across from the desk with a cup of coffee he hadn't touched, looking at the documents spread between them: acquisition records, shareholder registries, transfer confirmations, the full, quiet 3-year architecture of what M. Sterling had built. "Walk me through it one more time," Marcus said. Everett leaned forward and tapped the first page. 14 separate purchases. 4 shell entities, all legally registered, all compliant. First acquisition 3 years ago this November. Last acquisition 6 weeks ago. He paused. Total holdings as of this morning, 51% of outstanding shares in Caldwell Foods, Incorporated. 51%. Marcus let the number sit in the room. "And the filing," he asked. "Submitted to the Georgia Secretary of State's office at 8 o'clock this morning. It's on record as of now." Everett looked at him carefully. "Marcus, you are the majority shareholder of Caldwell Foods, legally, completely, and on the record." Marcus picked up his coffee. It had gone cold. He drank it anyway. 3 years ago, when Miss Opal first placed that manila envelope on his classroom desk, Marcus had not gone home and drawn up a revenge plan. That was not who he was. He had gone home and sat at his kitchen table for 4 hours, reading every page of the document twice, and asked himself one question: what happens to those 300 people if nobody stops this? The answer had been plain. The private equity firm Renata had been negotiating with a company called Meridian Capital Group, headquartered in Charlotte, had a documented history. Everett had found it in 2 days of research. In every acquisition they had completed in the past decade, the same pattern emerged: purchase the company, extract the assets, restructure operations within 90 days, and release the workforce. They called it optimization. The people who lost their jobs called it something else. 300 people. In Atlanta, in a difficult economy, with families and mortgages and children in school. Marcus had thought about Miss Opal's daughter Cheryl, who had worked in Caldwell Foods' accounting department for 11 years and was putting her own daughter through college on that salary. He had thought about the store managers he had met at company events, men and women who had given decades to a company that had started as one-man stocking shelves on the South Side with his own 2 hands. He had thought about Aldrich Sr.'s portrait in the foyer, those patient eyes, and he had called Everett, not for revenge, for intervention. Every share Marcus purchased was purchased with money he had saved and invested over years: his salary, an inheritance from his grandmother, returns from a small investment account he had started at 23. He had not touched their joint finances. He had not used a single dollar that belonged to Renata. He had simply been patient and careful and very, very quiet. At 9:15 that morning, Marcus drove home. Renata was in the dining room when he walked in. She was dressed beautifully white, deliberate the way she dressed when she had decided something. The manila envelope sat on the marble table in front of her. She slid it across to him with one smooth motion. "Sign it," she said. Marcus looked at the envelope. He looked at his wife, this woman he had loved once, genuinely and fully, before he understood what he was to her. He felt no anger. He had moved through anger a long time ago, somewhere between the locked studio door and the canceled credit card and the 12 people at that dinner table who had said nothing. What he felt now was something closer to sorrow, and beneath the sorrow, something steady and unshakable. He smiled. "Before you celebrate," he said quietly, "you might want to check who owns Caldwell Foods this morning." Renata's expression did not change immediately. She had prepared for several versions of this conversation: tears, pleading, negotiation, even anger. She had not prepared for calm. She had never quite known what to do with Marcus's calm. She laughed. "Marcus, please don't do this. Just sign the papers and we can both—" "Call your father," Marcus said simply. "Ask him to pull up the shareholder registry. The updated one. Filed this morning." Something shifted in Renata's face. A small thing. A hairline fracture in the certainty. She picked up her phone. She called Aldrich. Marcus sat back in his chair and waited. He could hear Aldrich's voice on the other end, the warm, distracted tone of a man who had been in the middle of something. He heard Renata ask the question, keeping her voice light, almost amused, as though she were humoring a child. He heard the silence that followed. He heard Aldrich's chair roll back from his desk. He heard the sound of a keyboard. Then nothing. 30 full seconds of nothing. Then Aldrich's voice came back, and it was different. All the warmth was gone. In its place was something Marcus had never heard from Aldrich Caldwell before. Fear. "Baby girl," Aldrich said. His voice was barely above a whisper. The word came out hollow, stripped of all its usual confidence, like a man who had just looked down and realized the ground beneath him was not where he thought it was. Renata's hand tightened on the phone. "Daddy, what?" "Baby girl." Aldrich's voice dropped even further, and then he said 4 words that his daughter would carry with her for the rest of her life. "Baby girl. He owns us." The phone slipped slightly in Renata's hand. She caught it. Her eyes moved slowly across the dining room to Marcus. He was still sitting in the same chair, still calm, still patient. He had not moved at all. They arrived within 40 minutes. Aldrich first, his silver Mercedes pulling into the driveway so fast it left tire marks on the brick. Then Cecilia in her own car, which meant she had been called separately, which meant Aldrich had called her on the way over, which meant the conversation in that car had been exactly the kind of conversation Cecilia Caldwell did not enjoy having. Then 2 of Renata's uncles, Aldrich's younger brothers Raymond and Curtis, who lived 20 minutes apart and had apparently decided to drive together, which told Marcus everything he needed to know about how quickly this family closed ranks. 4 cars in the driveway. 5 people walking through the front door within the span of 3 minutes. Marcus stood up from the dining room table and went to the kitchen. He filled a pitcher with water. He set out 6 glasses on a tray. He carried the tray to the dining room and placed it in the center of the table beside the divorce papers, which were still unsigned, still sitting in their envelope exactly where Renata had placed them. Then he sat back down. Renata watched him do all of this with an expression he had never seen on her face before. It was not anger. It was not contempt. It was something that looked for the first time in 6 years almost like uncertainty. Aldrich walked in first. He was a large man, 6 feet 2 inches broad across the shoulders, the kind of physical presence that had served him well in boardrooms for 40 years. But he walked into his daughter's dining room that morning, looking smaller than Marcus had ever seen him. His eyes went straight to Marcus and stayed there. "Son," he said, not warmly. The word was a question. "Mr. Caldwell," Marcus said, "please sit down." Aldrich sat. The others filed in behind him. Cecilia, sweeping past Marcus without acknowledgement, Raymond and Curtis taking chairs on either side of their brother Renata, moving to stand at the far end of the room with her arms crossed over her white dress. Nobody touched the water. "I want to understand," Aldrich said carefully, "what exactly I am looking at." Marcus reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and placed a single folded document on the table. Clean, precise, the way he did everything. "A shareholder certification," Marcus said, "issued this morning by the Georgia Secretary of State. M. Sterling Holdings, which I own entirely, holds 51% of outstanding shares in Caldwell Foods Incorporated. That is a controlling majority." Raymond leaned forward. "M. Sterling. Who in the who is M. Sterling?" "I am," Marcus said. Silence. Not the polite dinner table quiet of people choosing their words. The deep, pressurized silence of a room full of people whose understanding of reality has just been fundamentally revised. Cecilia spoke first, because Cecilia always spoke first. "This is absurd," she said. Her voice was sharp and certain, the voice she used when she needed a room to believe her. "Marcus is a school teacher. A school teacher does not. This is some kind of fraud. Aldrich, call the attorney. This is Cecilia." Aldrich's voice cut across hers, flat, final. She stopped. He looked at Marcus. "How long?" 3 years, Marcus said. Aldrich closed his eyes for exactly 4 seconds. Then he opened them again. "And the source of funds? Personal savings, an inheritance from my grandmother, investment returns. All documented, all legal, all completely separate from any joint marital finances." Marcus's voice was even. "My attorney can provide full disclosure within 24 hours. Aldrich nodded slowly. He looked like a man doing very difficult arithmetic in his head. The door opened. Nobody had knocked. Dominic Farr walked in wearing a charcoal suit and carrying a leather briefcase that he set on the dining room table with the confidence of a man who believed he owned the room. He was 43, smooth-faced, with the practiced ease of someone who had spent 2 decades making other people feel slightly off balance. He looked at Marcus, then at the document on the table, then back at Marcus. "I represent the interests of the majority shareholder in Caldwell Foods," Dominic said smoothly. "And I'm here to ensure that today's proceedings—" "The majority shareholder," Marcus said pleasantly, "is sitting at this table." Dominic stopped. The briefcase remained on the table. His hand was still on the handle. "I'm sorry," Dominic said. "M. Sterling Holdings," Marcus said. 51%, certified this morning." He tilted his head slightly. "Who exactly did you say you represent?" The color did something interesting in Dominic Farr's face. It didn't drain all at once. It went in stages, a slow recession, like a tide going out, starting at his jawline and moving upward. Raymond watched this happen from across the table. He leaned toward Curtis and said in a voice that was not quite a whisper, "Who is this man, and why does he look like that?" Dominic set his briefcase on the floor. He straightened. He looked at Renata. Renata was looking at the table. It was Aldrich who turned to his daughter. He turned slowly the way a man turns when he has been dreading the direction he is about to face. "Renata," he said. She looked up. "The firm this man represents." Aldrich's voice was very controlled now, the voice of someone keeping something large and hot behind a very thin wall. "Is it Meridian Capital?" Renata said nothing. That was its own answer. Aldrich pressed both palms flat on the table. His chest rose and fell once slowly. Raymond and Curtis exchanged a look over his head, the look of men who have just realized they are witnessing something their family will be talking about for decades. "You were selling the company," Aldrich said. not a question. "Daddy." Behind my back, without telling me, without asking me. His voice stayed controlled. It was almost worse that way. 300 people, Renata. The deal would have been good for the 300 people, Aldrich said again. Quiet, immovable. People whose children go to school on those salaries. People your grandfather knew by name. The room was absolutely still. Renata looked at Marcus. It was the first time all morning she had looked at him directly, not through him, not past him, but actually at him. And something moved across her face. Not guilt exactly. Something more complicated than guilt. The expression of a person who is beginning to understand the full dimensions of what they have done. "Who are you?" Renata whispered. Marcus looked at her steadily. No anger in his eyes, no satisfaction, just a clear, unwavering calm that had been 37 years in the making. "I'm exactly who I always was," he said. "You just never bothered to look." Nobody spoke. The silence said everything. Aldrich Caldwell was not a man who made threats lightly. In 40 years of business, he had learned that the men who shouted across tables accomplished less than the men who spoke quietly and meant every word. He had built Caldwell Foods on that principle. He had raised his daughter on it, or tried to. He looked at Dominic Farr across the dining room table with the measured patience of a man who had already made a decision and was simply waiting for the right moment to deliver it. "You have two choices," Aldrich said. "You can tell me everything right now in this room, or I pick up this phone and call Judge Harold Briggs, who has been my personal attorney for 22 years, and we have this conversation in a very different setting." He paused. "Harold is not a patient man." Dominic looked at Renata again. Renata had moved to the window. She stood with her back partially to the room, her arms still crossed, her white dress catching the morning light in a way that would have been beautiful under any other circumstances. She did not look at Dominic. She did not nod or shake her head or give him any signal at all. She had left him alone in the middle of the room. Dominic understood then with the particular clarity that comes when a carefully constructed arrangement suddenly has no floor, that he had never been a partner in this. He had been a tool. And Renata Caldwell Price had just put the tool down. He sat. He opened his briefcase. And he talked. It took 31 minutes. Dominic laid it out with the exhausted precision of a man who had rehearsed a different version of this conversation, one where he was in control and was now delivering it in the only version left available to him. Meridian Capital Group had approached Renata 14 months ago. The terms were straightforward. Meridian would acquire Caldwell Foods at a valuation of $44 million. Of that, after taxes and restructuring costs, Renata would personally receive $11 million deposited into a private account, in her name, only an account her father did not know existed, an account her husband had never been told about. In exchange, Renata would obtain Marcus's signature on the divorce settlement, which had been crafted by Dominic to include a clause buried in the legal language of page 9 that would waive Marcus's right to contest any major asset transaction initiated within the marriage period. If Marcus signed without reading carefully, and Dominic had been confident he would, because Dominic had underestimated Marcus the way everyone in this house had underestimated Marcus, the sale could proceed uncontested within 60 days. Aldrich listened to every word without moving. Raymond had stopped pretending not to listen 20 minutes ago. Curtis had taken out a small notepad and was writing things down with the focused expression of a man who intended to remember this conversation in detail for the rest of his life. Cecilia had not said a single word since Aldrich silenced her. She sat very upright in her chair with her hands folded in her lap and her face arranged in the careful blankness of a woman processing something she would need considerable time to fully absorb. When Dominic finished, Aldrich turned to his daughter. $11 million, he said slowly. Renata turned from the window. Her chin was still up. But her eyes were different now. The certainty was gone, and what had replaced it was something rawer and less composed. The company was going to be sold eventually, she said. You know that, Daddy. You're not going to run it forever, and I would have given you the company, Aldrich said. His voice broke on the last word. Just slightly. Just enough. Renata, I would have handed it to you. All you had to do was ask. Renata opened her mouth. Nothing came out. The room was shaking with silence. The door to the dining room opened quietly. Nobody had heard a car in the driveway. Nobody had heard a knock. But Miss Opal Hensley stood in the doorway in her good wool coat, her reading glasses on their beaded chain, holding her manila envelope against her chest, like a woman who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and was finally ready to set it down. She looked around the room. She took in Aldrich, Raymond, Curtis, Cecilia, Dominic, Renata. She looked at Marcus last, and something passed between them, not surprise on either side, just a quiet recognition, the look of two people who had been moving toward the same moment from different directions. I apologize for coming unannounced, Miss Opal said. Her voice was unhurried. But I believe I have something this room needs to see. She walked to the table and placed the envelope down. Inside that envelope, she said, you will find printed copies of 47 emails exchanged between Renata Price and Dominic Farr over the past 14 months. The dates, the terms, the account numbers, all of it. She paused. You will also find a transcript. A transcript of what? Raymond asked. Miss Opal looked at Renata. A phone call, she said quietly. Made approximately 2 years ago, to a landlord named Gerald Potts, in which the caller, using this address as a callback number, informed Mr. Potts that his tenant Marcus Price had a history of erratic behavior and posed a potential liability risk to the building. The room went very still. Cecilia reached out and picked up the transcript before anyone else moved. She read the first paragraph. She read the second. Her eyes moved down the page with the slow, methodical focus of a woman who was making absolutely certain she understood what she was reading before she responded to it. She set the paper down. She looked at her daughter. In 34 years of watching Cecilia Caldwell operate in rooms, the sharp comments, the pointed silences, the careful management of how the family appeared to the world, Marcus had never once seen her without an answer ready. Cecilia always had an answer. Cecilia always had a position, a deflection, a reframe. She had none of those things now. When she spoke, her voice had lost every hard edge. What was left was something smaller and more honest than anything Marcus had ever heard from her. It was the voice of a mother looking at her child across a room full of wreckage and not knowing for the first time what to say. Renata, Cecilia whispered. Her hands were shaking slightly on the table. What did you do? The room went silent. Even Dominic Farr did not move. And Renata Caldwell Price, who had walked into this morning in white, certain of everything, stood at the window of her own dining room and had no answer left to give. Miss Opal did not sit down. She stood at the head of the table the way she had stood at the front of rooms her entire life, not with authority borrowed from a title or a position, but with the particular stillness of someone who has lived long enough to know exactly how much space they are entitled to occupy. She looked around the table slowly, at Aldrich, whose eyes were red at the corners but whose jaw was set, at Raymond and Curtis, who had stopped taking notes and were simply watching, at Cecilia, who had not moved since she set the transcript down, at Dominic Farr, who had the diminished look of a man who understood that his professional life had just changed irrevocably in a dining room in Atlanta on a Tuesday morning. Then she looked at Renata. "I have worked for this family for 30 years, Miss Opal said. "I was hired by your grandfather, Aldrich Sr., in the 3rd year of the company. I was there when there were 3 stores. I was there when there were 11. I was there the morning your father signed the papers that took it to 42. She paused. "I loved this company, not because of what it was worth, because of what it meant to the people inside it." Renata said nothing. She had moved from the window to a chair at the far end of the table. She sat with her hands in her lap, her white dress immaculate, her face doing the complicated work of a person who is deciding in real time which version of themselves to be. "I retired with board observation rights," Miss Opal continued. "A small clause in an old agreement. Nobody remembered it was there. It gave me the right to review certain financial documents on a quarterly basis, documents that fell within the scope of my former role as senior accounts manager." She placed one hand flat on the envelope, including the term sheets from any proposed acquisition or sale. Aldrich looked up sharply. "You had access to the Meridian documents?" "I did," Miss Opal said simply. "Legally and completely. The access was never revoked because no one thought to revoke it." She looked at him directly. "I want you to know, Aldrich, I never used that access for anything other than what it was intended for. I reviewed those documents because it was my right to do so. And when I understood what they contained, I knew I had a decision to make." She turned to Marcus then. And the room shifted in the way rooms shift when the most important thing that is going to be said is about to be said. "The reason I brought those documents to Marcus," Miss Opal said, "was not only because of what Renata was planning to do to this company. It was because of who Marcus Price is." She paused. "And because of who his grandmother was." Aldrich frowned slowly. "His grandmother?" "Dorothy Price," Miss Opal said. "Born Dorothy Mae Washington, raised on Ashby Street, taught 2nd grade at Booker T. Washington Elementary for 31 years. She looked around the table. "And my oldest, dearest friend in this world for 52 years until she passed." The room was completely quiet. Marcus was very still. His eyes were on Miss Opal. And for the first time all morning, the composure that had carried him through every moment of this day showed its first small crack, not in his face exactly, but somewhere around his eyes where a brightness had gathered that he was working to hold back. "Dorothy used to talk about her grandson." Miss Opal continued, her voice softening at the edges. "The quiet one, the one who painted." She said, Miss Opal stopped for a moment, collecting herself. She said he had the kind of patience that was going to make him great someday. She said the world was going to underestimate him, and that was going to be the world's problem, not his. A sound moved through the room. Not a word. Just a breath, collective, involuntary, the sound a group of people makes when something true and irreversible has just landed among them. Cecilia pressed 2 fingers to her mouth. Raymond looked at the table. Aldrich looked at Marcus. "I didn't ask her to help me," Marcus said quietly. His voice was steady but lower than usual, the way voices go when emotion is being carefully managed rather than suppressed. "I want that to be clear. Miss Opal made her own choice. I didn't recruit her. I didn't ask her for anything." "I know that," Miss Opal said. "That's precisely why I trusted you with it." She reached into her coat pocket and placed one more document on the table, smaller than the others. A single page folded once. "This is a letter," she said, "written by Dorothy Price 18 months before she passed. She gave it to me and told me to use my judgment about when to share it." Miss Opal looked at Marcus. "I believe the time is now." Marcus looked at the folded page for a long moment. He did not reach for it immediately. He breathed in once slowly and then picked it up. He unfolded it. He read it. The room watched him read it, and the room saw what happened to his face as he did the careful composure built over years of dinners where nobody said his name right, and credit cards that stopped working, and studio doors that wouldn't open. All of it moved, shifted, and for one unguarded moment, Marcus Price looked exactly like what he was. A man who had been loved completely by someone who was no longer here, and who had just been reminded of it in a room full of people who had spent years making him feel like he was less. His eyes filled. He did not let the tears fall, but they were there, bright and full and real, and every person at that table saw them. Aldrich stood up from his chair. He walked the length of the table slowly. He stopped in front of Marcus, and Aldrich Caldwell, who had never once, in 6 years of Sunday dinners and company events and family photographs, asked Marcus Price how he was doing, never once defended him from his wife's comments or his daughter's indifference, stood in front of his son-in-law and said 3 words in a voice that cost him something to say. "I am sorry." Not a performance, not a calculation. Just a man standing in the wreckage of his assumptions, offering the only thing he had left that was worth anything. Marcus looked up at him. He nodded once. Then Renata's voice came from the end of the table, clipped, controlled, grasping for the authority she had walked in with that morning. "I want the divorce finalized today," she said. "Marcus, sign the papers. Whatever else is happening here, sign the papers, and let's be done." Marcus looked at her. He smiled, not the smile from this morning, not the one that had frightened her, but something quieter and more final. "I'll sign them," he said. "But first you need to read the counter-filing my attorney submitted this morning." He reached into his jacket and placed a second document on the table. Renata snatched it. She turned to the first page. She read the opening paragraph. Then she sat down very slowly because her legs had stopped working. The counterfiling was 11 pages long. Renata read the first paragraph 3 times. Then she set it down and picked it up again, the way a person rereads something when they are hoping the words will rearrange themselves into something more manageable the second time around. They did not. Marcus's attorney, a woman named Claudette Okafor, who had been practicing family and corporate law in Atlanta for 26 years, had prepared the document with the kind of precision that left no room for negotiation, interpretation, or delay. Every clause was clear, every term was specific, every consequence was named directly and without softening. Raymond reached across the table and picked up the document after Renata set it down. He read the first page. Then he handed it to Curtis without a word. The document moved around the table. Each person read it. Each person was quiet after. The counterfiling contained 3 primary provisions. The first was a legally binding protective covenant, a formal restriction attached to Marcus's controlling majority stake in Caldwell Foods, prohibiting the sale, transfer, or acquisition of the company by any private equity firm, investment group, or external corporate entity for a period of 15 years. The covenant would remain in force regardless of any future changes in personal ownership of Marcus's shares. It was, in effect, a permanent shield around the company and around the 300 people who depended on it, that no divorce settlement, no legal maneuver, and no subsequent negotiation could dissolve. The second provision directed that the recorded voicemail transcript, Renata's call to Gerald Potts, be formally submitted to the liability insurance carrier for Potts's building, along with a documented valuation of the artwork lost when Marcus's studio was unlawfully vacated. 2 years of work, 14 months of the Grandmother series alone. Claudette Okafor had retained an independent art appraiser who had placed the total loss at $230,000. The third provision was the simplest. Marcus was not requesting spousal support. He was not requesting the house. He was not requesting any share of Renata's personal accounts or inheritance. He was requesting one thing: that Renata Caldwell Price sign an acknowledgement formal witnessed and filed with the court that she had provided false information to a third party for the purpose of causing professional and financial harm to her spouse. Not a criminal filing, not a lawsuit. Just the truth on record permanently. Aldrich read the third provision twice. Then he looked at his daughter with an expression that had moved entirely beyond anger into something sadder and more permanent. "He's not even asking for money," Aldrich said quietly. "After everything." Dominic Farr attempted to speak once more. He had been sitting in his chair with the diminished posture of a man who understood that the room had entirely stopped, including him in its calculations. But lawyers, even compromised ones, have a difficult time staying quiet when documents are being discussed. "The protective covenant," Dominic began, "may be contestable on the grounds that." Aldrich picked up his phone. He did not dial. He simply held the phone in his hand and looked at Dominic Farr with the patient, unhurried expression of a man who has already decided what happens next and is simply waiting for the other person to catch up. "Harold Briggs," Aldrich said. 22 years, one phone call." Dominic closed his mouth. He picked up his briefcase. He stood. He looked once more at Renata, a last searching look, as though hoping she might finally offer him something to work with. Renata was looking at the counter filing. Dominic walked out of the dining room. The front door opened and closed behind him. 2 weeks later, a formal complaint was filed with the Georgia State Bar Association, submitted by Aldrich Caldwell, personally citing conflict of interest, ethical violations, and the deliberate misrepresentation of client identity in a legal proceeding. Dominic Farr's license to practice law in the state of Georgia was suspended pending investigation within 45 days. It was never reinstated. The private account, the one in Renata's name, the one holding the funds she had arranged with Meridian Capital, was flagged by the Caldwell family attorney during the divorce asset disclosure process. Marital asset concealment was a serious matter under Georgia law. Claudette Okafor noted it carefully in the supplementary filing. Renata's personal legal fees over the following months depleted the account entirely. Every dollar she had saved for Portugal for the villa, for the version of her life she had planned, without Marcus in it, gone. Paid to attorneys who could not save her from a situation she had built herself, brick by careful brick, over 3 years of underestimating a quiet man in a gray jacket. The divorce was granted on a Wednesday morning in a courtroom downtown. It took 11 minutes. Marcus signed his name at the bottom of the settlement agreement with the same steady hand he used to write comments on his students' artwork. He signed without ceremony. He capped his pen. He stood, shook Claudette's hand, and thanked her. Then he walked out of the courthouse into the Atlanta morning, 64 degrees Fahrenheit, the sky a clean, uncomplicated blue, carrying one bag. They were waiting at the bottom of the courthouse steps. 12 of them. His third period class, led by Amara, who had apparently organized the entire thing via a group chat the night before, without telling a single adult. They were holding large sheets of paper, the kind used for classroom projects, and on each sheet, painted carefully in the colors Marcus had taught them to mix, were recreations of the paintings from his grandmother series. Not perfect. Some of the proportions were off, and the perspective in 2 of them made him want to smile. But the hands, his grandmother's hands at different ages, which he had described to his students during a class about source material and personal history, were rendered with a tenderness that stopped him at the bottom of the steps. He stood there looking at them. His chest tightened. His eyes burned. He pressed his lips together and breathed in slowly through his nose, and tried very hard to hold himself together in front of 12 teenagers who were watching him with the open, unguarded care that young people offer before the world teaches them it isn't safe to. He did not hold it together. The tears came quietly. Not the broken kind, not the defeated kind, but the kind that come when something you thought was gone turns out to have been held for you the whole time. He stood on the courthouse steps in the Atlanta morning and cried, and he did not apologize for it, and not one of his students looked away. Amara walked up and handed him her painting, the largest one the grandmother's hands at 70 holding a paintbrush. "You said build something they can't take," she said. "So we built this." Marcus took the painting. He held it carefully, the way you hold something irreplaceable. Miss Opal appeared from somewhere behind the students she had known, of course, because Miss Opal always knew, and she put her arms around him the way his grandmother used to, firm and certain and without condition. "Your grandmother," she whispered into his shoulder, "would be so proud." Marcus held on. Across town in the house on Cascade Road, Aldrich Caldwell walked out of his front door, got into his silver Mercedes, and drove away. He did not look up at the window where his daughter stood watching. Not even once. 6 months is enough time for a life to become unrecognizable. Not always in the ways you expect. Sometimes the biggest changes are the quiet ones, the ones that don't announce themselves, that simply appear one morning in the way the light falls through a window or in the sound of a door opening onto something new. Marcus's new studio was on the second floor of a building on Ralph David Abernathy Boulevard, 1,200 square feet, with north-facing windows that caught the morning light exactly the way the old studio had. The walls were bare when he moved in. They were not bare anymore. He had applied for a small arts grant in the month after the divorce. He received it $8,000, enough to cover the first 6 months of rent and the cost of new supplies. The rest came from an unexpected source, a fundraiser organized entirely by the parents of his students who had learned what happened to his artwork and responded the way communities respond when they recognize one of their own has been wronged. He had tried to refuse the money. Amara's mother, a woman named Desiree, who had the particular determination of someone who had raised a child. Like Amara had looked at him and said, "You are going to take this, and you are going to make something beautiful, and we are going to come see it. That is how this works." He had taken it. The spring show, the one that had been canceled 2 years ago when the studio door wouldn't open, was rescheduled for April. Every ticket sold within 3 days. Amara designed the program. She was also, as of that March, enrolled in the graphic design program at Spelman College, with a scholarship that Marcus had spent 4 months quietly helping her secure. He did not tell her about the phone calls. She found out from her mother. She showed up at the studio on a Saturday with a card she had made herself and stood in the doorway, looking at him with the expression of someone who has just understood the full size of a thing they had only partially seen before. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," Marcus said. She hugged him. He patted her on the shoulder awkwardly, the way teachers do when they are moved and don't quite know what to do with it. Caldwell Foods did not close. It did not shrink. All 300 employees kept their jobs, kept their salaries, kept their health coverage. Aldrich returned to the office 2 weeks after the divorce was finalized and began the quiet work of rebuilding not the company which had never been broken, but his own understanding of what it was for and who it belonged to. He named a new board. He restructured the leadership, and in a move that surprised everyone who heard about it and confused several people who didn't understand the full story, He asked Marcus Price to serve as a non-executive community advisor to the board, with a specific focus on employee welfare initiatives. Marcus accepted. He attended one meeting per quarter. He asked the kinds of questions that made accountants uncomfortable and operations managers think differently about their assumptions. He was by every account exactly as useful as Aldrich had hoped, and twice as perceptive as anyone had expected. Miss Opal's daughter, Cheryl, kept her position in the accounting department. She was promoted to senior accounts manager, the same role Miss Opal had held for the last 12 years of her career. Miss Opal cried when she heard. She called Marcus to tell him. He listened for a long time without saying much. When she finished, he said, "Your grandmother would be proud of you too, Miss Opal." She laughed, and then she cried a little more. Renata left Atlanta in October quietly, without announcement, the way people leave when they know the city has seen too much of them. She relocated to another state. The details were her own. What she did with the distance between herself and everything she had lost, that was also her own. Some lessons are private, some reckonings happen in rooms no one else is allowed to enter. She did not contest the protective covenant. She did not appeal the court's findings. She signed every document placed in front of her, and she left. Marcus finished his first new painting on a Thursday evening in November, when the studio was quiet, and the city outside was doing its usual thing, alive, moving, full of people carrying lives that were heavier than they looked. He stepped back and looked at it. It was his grandmother's hands. Young this time, maybe 25, maybe younger. Holding nothing. Just open. The way hands look when they are ready for whatever comes next. He stood there for a long time. Then he turned off the studio light and went home. There is a particular kind of person the world loves to overlook. The quiet one. The patient one. The one who doesn't shout, doesn't perform, doesn't demand that anyone pay attention. The world looks at that person and sees someone safe to ignore. What the world forgets every single time is that patience is not the absence of power. It is power in its longest, most deliberate form. Marcus Price did not win because he was louder or harder or more ruthless than the people who tried to erase him. He won because he never stopped building quietly, steadily, with clean hands and a clear heart, something they could not take. The people who underestimate quiet men always forget still water runs deep. If this story moved you, if you saw someone you know in Marcus or someone you love in Miss Opal, or maybe even a version of yourself in the person who finally stood up, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment right now. Tell me where you are watching from and what time it is there. Tell me which moment hit you the hardest. Was it the courthouse steps? Was it Aldrich walking away without looking back? Was it Miss Opal and that letter? And if you are not subscribed, yet please do that right now. Hit that bell so you never miss a story. Because every week we come back here and we tell the truth about what people go through and what they survive and what they build on the other side of it. Thank you for being here. I will see you in the next one.